Hi everyone, welcome to part 3 of Jacksonian America. Today we're going to be talking about the development of the second party system. Our questions to think about: first, why does the second party system develop? What causes this? And then second, which political parties make up the second party system? To take a step back, to give us a little backstory, the first party system developed in the late 1790s. We talked about how John Adams represented the Federalists, how Thomas Jefferson represented the Democratic Republicans. But as we get into the first couple decades of the 1800s, the Federalist Party dies. And the Democratic Republicans have sort of melted across the entire political spectrum. And so in that era of good feelings, we talk about not really having political parties, but in reality, everyone was sort of some flavor of Republican. And they called them Republicans, even though they were not our Republican Party that we have today. But when Andrew Jackson killed the Bank of the United States, he makes a lot of people angry. And these people, they all have their own political ideas, their own agendas, and what they think of as important. But they're starting to have a common enemy, and that's going to bring people together. Andrew Jackson killing the Bank of the United States fires us up into the second party system. The brand new political party that is created is called the Whig Party. And this name is deliberate. If we think back to the American Revolution, the revolutionaries used the term Whig to mean people who oppose the king. In the 1830s, the Whig Party is going to choose that name for much the same reason. When you take a look at this image on the screen, it shows President Jackson as a king. He's standing on the Constitution. In his hand, he holds a scroll that is labeled veto, and that's a reference to the Bank of the United States. So this is a political party that is created because everyone hates Andrew Jackson. And people believe that what he did to the Bank of the United States was an overstepping of power. That President Andrew Jackson, was somehow trying to become King Andrew Jackson. So when we take a look at who makes up the Whig Party, it's actually three major factions coming together to create this party. First, the National Republicans led by Henry Clay. We've already talked a lot about Henry Clay. He is going to be with us throughout the next couple of decades. Second, we have ex-Federalists. So if we think about New England, we think about guys like Daniel Webster. Those people still hold similar beliefs, but their party doesn't exist anymore. So those people are going to move into the Whig Party. And then finally, we have a group of Southerners who are upset with Andrew Jackson over the issue of nullification. So remember that Andrew Jackson opposes nullification, and so these Southerners are angry with him because of that. In the presidential election of 1836, this is the first time we see the Whig Party at the national level. And they're going to take an interesting strategy. Instead of trying to unify behind one candidate, the Whig Party is going to put up three different candidates. And this is kind of an interesting strategy because the Whig Party is brand new. So it's going to be difficult to get these different factions to rally behind one candidate. Like, which candidate do you choose if you represent one faction over the others, those other factions won't be happy. So the Whig Party is going to put up 3 different candidates. And so when we take a look at the Electoral College map here from 1836, starting at the bottom, Daniel Webster is listed as a Whig candidate, and he represents sort of that older Federalist Party from the Northeast. Moving up one, Hugh Lawson White is from Georgia, and he's going to represent that Southern component that's angry with President Jackson. And then finally, William Henry Harrison, he's from Indiana, and he represents sort of that national Republican element that Henry Clay was a part of. And it's kind of interesting here that in 1836, the Whigs don't select Henry Clay as their candidate. That's kind of an interesting move. Now, you might think that this strategy is doomed to fail, because if the Whig Party is putting up 3 different candidates, how could one of those candidates actually win 51% of the Electoral College votes? And the answer is they probably wouldn't. But this is where the strategy is sort of brilliant, because each of these factions could possibly chip away at Martin Van Buren's majority in the Electoral College. So it's possible that each of these 3 Whig candidates could chip away and leave Martin Van Buren with less than 51% of the Electoral College votes, which means the House of Representatives would decide the election, and maybe, possibly, a Whig candidate could come out ahead in the House of Representatives. Sadly, that's not what happens. Martin Van Buren, riding President Jackson's coattails, because remember, Martin Van Buren was Andrew Jackson's vice president, he wins 58% of the Electoral College vote. So he wins the election outright, and the Whig strategy fails. But in 1836, the bus dies, and immediately the economy is launched into an economic crisis. I mean, this is a terrible situation. People are losing their jobs, people are homeless, and the entire economy is struggling because the stability that the Bank of the United States had brought is gone. And so throughout his presidency, Martin Van Buren is struggling against this economic crisis. And so moving ahead to the presidential election of 1840, the Whigs have started to solidify enough that they are going to rally behind one candidate. And it's interesting that they choose William Henry Harrison, because this guy's been described as the Whig version of Andrew Jackson. He was a military man. He made a name for himself fighting Indians out west in Indiana. And he sort of has that rugged log cabin kind of feel to him, trying to appeal to the common man. And in the end, between the terrible economy and the Whigs rallying behind William Henry Harrison, look at the map. William Henry Harrison wins 80% of the Electoral College vote. That's a landslide victory. So what does this mean? In the end, this sets the precedent. The United States would be a political system of 2 major parties. Sometimes a third party would come in and make a splash, but for the most part, we're going to settle on a 2-party system. So the question is, why does the second party system develop? It's because of the bank war, because people are opposed to Andrew Jackson. And so they're creating the Whig Party to oppose Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party. And that also answers our second question. Which political parties make up the second party system? The Democrats, initially led by Andrew Jackson and then Martin Van Buren, and then the Whig Party, which sees the election of William Henry Harrison in 1840.